Okay, am I coming through?
Loud and clear, Becca.
Marvellous. Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to be with you today on the first of its kind, this collaboration between HCPC and BPS. So a word about who I am. So my name's Rebecca Eglinton and I'm a clinical psychologist, and my current role is as Chief Psychologist of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. And I've been a BPS member for many years, and I also sit on the faculty for leadership and management. With another hat, as of January this year, I became a registrant member with the HCPC, and I'm just really excited about psychology having more of a voice within the HCPC, particularly with the challenges and changing landscape for health and social care that we have been living through, but also will be facing over coming years. So I'm really, really pleased to see that HCPC and BPS collaborating on this really important issue of supervision. So really hope that we all take something useful away from today. If we move on to the next slide, I think there's a few just sort of overview points to make. So the webinar is hosted by Kim. Thank you. So thank you to you, Kim, for being in the background, and I know you're going to be moving the slides on and so on. Just to point you in the direction of a few things. So the HCPC updated its website with its materials on supervision last year, and these materials include a definition of supervision, links to HCPC standards, the benefits and outcomes of supervision, approaching supervision case studies, and FAQs. As psychologists, we are often seen as experts in the arena, and we certainly have a lot to share on supervision, and of course routinely engage in supervision as part of our role. And the BPS are currently developing the Society's drafting of supervision guidelines, which is really great to see, and Nigel may say a little bit more about that. So really the aim of the session is, of course, in an hour and a half, we're not going to be able to cover everything. But our aim today was really to create some space to give us all some interesting questions to ask, some food for thought, and cover a number of different issues that you see there, from principles to thinking about diversity and inclusion issues, and thinking about when things go wrong or a little more tricky, how we handle safeguarding issues and ethical dilemmas. And hopefully something for us all to take away. And I know that Kim has also provided some further reading as well, which sort of sometimes it can just be helpful when people give you sort of a good recommendation of further things to look for. So I'm very pleased to hand over to you, Kim. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Becca. That's wonderful. So a few sort of housekeeping things, if you don't mind. People have already started to put chat. Put things in chat, put questions in chat. I put a couple of comments in chat. So please use chat for questions, for comments, for any concerns you want to raise, then we're really happy to answer those. There's 3 of my colleagues in the background and Nigel Atta from the British Psychological Society, all answering questions in chat. So there'll be lots of time to do that, if that's all right. The session is 90 minutes long. It finishes at 2:30 today, and we will make sure that it finishes on time for you. Now, we have quite a lot of other speakers, which we're really so lucky to have today. You know, some real experts in their field. And what we're going to do, if that's okay, we are going to ask them to introduce themselves before each session, because otherwise they'll introduce themselves now and then everybody will forget what they do and what their role is. So it will be much nicer if they introduce themselves before their part of the session, if that's all right. We will share the slides, and as Becca says, we've got a list of resources after the event that we'll be sharing with you. So you will all get an email from us after the event saying that. The session is being recorded. We will put it onto our HCPC YouTube channel when we've finished the series of our webinars that we've been doing over the last few months. And don't forget, should I say, it can be used for your CPD. So this will hopefully be really useful for a CPD session if you want to write this up. A few sort of things about also social media. If anybody is on Twitter, it'd be really nice if you want to tweet about the session, points that you think are useful, anything you want to say about the session. And if you use the hashtag #MyHCPCStandards, and if you also hook in at the HCPC. We've got my colleague Becca, who comes from our communications and media team, who's really happy to read your comments and retweet and take questions, as I said, so that might be quite useful. And don't forget, if you enjoy these sessions, then do look on our events page, which we'll signpost you to later for any other sessions that you think might be useful to come along to. So without any further ado, I'm going to move on to a first question. Now, I asked you right at the beginning if you had time to just link on to a polling app. I'm going to use my phone to actually make it work. It's just really nice for us to know who's with us today. So I'm going to ask you very quickly, if you don't mind, to vote. Which professional group do you belong to? Somebody's already asked in chat. Thank you very much for asking. It's a super question. If this session is specifically for psychologists, it actually isn't specifically for psychologists, but it's actually useful for everybody. And we've all been cognizant, we've all been thinking about that when we've been preparing our session today. It's a general session, but we've called on the British Psychological Society, particularly developing their supervision guidelines, which Nigel will talk about in a bit, because they've been looking specifically at supervision to talk us through some of the issues. So I hope that will be quite useful. So I can see already and I'm sure that you can see it as well, that we've got quite a lot of occupational therapists in the room, got quite a lot of practitioner psychologists in the room as well. So that's really nice. So don't forget to use the chat if you can for any questions, anything you want to ask. We will make sure that we answer. We've got, as I said, about 3 or 4 people answering all those questions as we go along. But this gives us a really good idea, if that's okay with you, about who's with us today. So I can see it's changing as we go, as usual, and we've got quite a lot of people who've already voted. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to go off that now, if that's all right, and we will see. We've still got some people some professions not represented, and I actually think that that's a message for us at the HCPC to be thinking about. If people are not signing up or not wanting to sign up for our webinars or not getting the message out, then that's actually a message for us to be thinking how we advertise these events. So it's actually really useful for us to know. So thank you very much for that information. That's super, super useful. So I'm going to hand over to Nigel. We've been lucky enough to develop this sort of very collaboratively with Nigel at the British Psychological Society, and Nigel is a policy advisor there. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself a little bit more, Nigel, and Nigel's going to talk to you a little bit about the role of the British Psychological Society. Thanks, Nigel.
Thank you very much indeed, Kim. If you just move on to the next slide, please. So I'm Nigel Atter. I'm a policy advisor at the British Psychological Society. I work in the Society's practice team. I've seen a lot of change in the organisation, having worked here for the last 20 years or so. I'm just going to shoot through a sort of brief overview of the Society to set this event in context. But I first of all wanted to thank everybody for attending and taking some time out of their busy working day to attend what I think is a really important session on supervision, and also just to recognise that this is the first joint BPS HCPC webinar that we've worked on, and I'm hoping that there will be many more thereafter. The Society is a professional body. It's a registered charity and a learned organisation. It was established in 1901, so we are one of the oldest psychological societies in the world. We have over 50,000 members, of which 20,000 of them are chartered. So that's one quite a special category of membership at the BPS for those that have engaged in training and come to a certain level of expertise. We have 154 member networks, and these are sort of member groups that work together in advancing the profession, and they keep us certainly very busy with their ideas, and we pick those up and try and advance the profession, drawing on those proposals. We are also have a royal charter, and so that helps us guide in what we can do for the profession and for psychologists in particularly. Next slide, please, Kim. So we are an inclusive and member-centred organisation. Much of our work is derived from ideas and proposals from members. We have a diverse membership in which we support in every stage of their career, from students, A-level students, to undergraduates, postgraduates and beyond, members that work in providing services to the public, members that work in the higher education sector, delivering teaching and learning, and some of those are internationally renowned for their expertise either in practice and or research. So we collectively want to advance the evidence base of the profession itself through research and practice, and through education and innovation. So we prioritise the Society's resources to deliver influential and effective and impactful outcomes for our members, the general public, and wider society beyond. And I'll probably just highlight two examples of that, where we have a Senate and members choose to run a Senate campaign. So I was active in two of those, and one was specifically about raising the levels of understanding and political engagement with children and young people's mental health, and also a campaign entitled From Poverty to Flourishing, highlighting the cognitive impact of poverty on children and people, and the impact of adversity, particularly within childhood. Next slide, please, Kim. So I am a member of the practice team, and so we're here to develop practice guidance for members, but that guidance is used by other professions and indeed by the HCPC themselves. We also attend to practice and ethical inquiries. So we have like a special day, but we get inquiries throughout the week, and we will provide guidance drawing on published work that the Society has. We also support the Society's practice board, which is one of our governance boards, so that we would take proposals from members, consider them within that particular board, and then allocate resources to attend to those. And of course, one of those proposals that was successful was the development of the Society's own supervision guidelines, and some of the speakers that follow me today are on that very group. We are currently on version 6, and I hope that we will have had approval from our governance board, and then following a society-wide consultation, including external stakeholders, to have those published in the spring of next year. The practice board also supports a wide range of advisory groups and task and finish groups. So we have advisory groups on expert witnesses, on safeguarding, on workforce, on the Mental Health Act, for example, and also the Mental Capacity Act. And other than supporting development work on supervision, we're working for some guidance on assistant psychologists, on memory, and on the consultant title. We also have a really important function in liaison between ourselves and the HCPC. So our liaison manager is Kelly Green, which Kim and other colleagues at the HCPC will know very well. This has been ongoing for about a year or so now, and that's been really helpful in cementing very positive, collaborative working relationships between the two organisations, which in part has led to today's event. I have put up our practice team email address there. So if members do have any questions later on relating to practice or the practice of psychology, then we'll be able to pick them up via that email address. And I think, Kim, that's probably the end of my brief presentation.
That's great, Nigel. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
So just briefly about the HCPC, and I just wanted to obviously talk a little bit about the supervision information that's on our website. Like Nigel, it's really only recently been put up, really, and obviously the main focus of today is actually that's a bit of a slide about our role, but the main focus today is about standards. And in our standards of conduct, formal and ethics, we actually haven't got any specific requirements related to supervision, but they are woven into our standards of proficiency. For example, understanding the importance of participation in training, supervision and mentoring, and working in partnership with colleagues. So they're actually quite heavily within our standards of proficiency. And of course, supervision is a great way to demonstrate your CPD. So they're in our continuing professional development guidance. We do have a statement on supervision, which I will pop in chat, which is quite useful. It is on our website. So my colleague Patrick, I know, will kindly put the link to the HCPC supervision website, which has got lots and lots of information on it. And you can see this is going to be unpicked later during the sessions, really, because lots of my other colleagues are going to look at things like reflection, developing knowledge, and regular support with other healthcare professionals. That's quite nice. We've got a really nice graphic on our website about the benefits and outcomes of effective supervision. And the one I really wanted to highlight on was the fact that it really is about better person-centered outcomes. And it's all about improving patient care. Supervision leads to improvements in patient care because it identifies issues early that you can talk about during supervision. You can seek advice, you can look for solutions with your supervisor. So some really good information there about the benefits, but again, we're going to look at those later if that's okay. We do have some great guidance for supervisors and for supervisees. The one that I've put up here is actually for supervisees, and it talks about things like choosing the right supervisor, the amount of supervision. We don't give these stipulations, but we provide guidance, and some of the things that are there are based on some research that we did about supervision that again I'll put out on the chat if that's okay. But I'm going to pass over to Janice now. Janice is, as it says there, a lead consultant psychologist. And Janice, thank you very much. I'll let you tell the audience a little bit about what you do, but you're going to really look at the principles of supervision, aren't you?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. And good afternoon, everybody. Yes, my name is Dr. Janice Smith. I've been working in the NHS for 35 years. Seems a long time, probably because it is. But today I'm going to look at a subject that's very close to my heart. I've done a lot with clinical supervision generally within one of the biggest trusts, mental health trusts in the country, where I was an inpatient lead consultant for children and young people. So can I have the next slide, please? So the definition of supervision, super meaning above and videre meaning see or observe from the Latin, meaning general overseeing from above, obviously. But it's really important, and this is a generic view of supervision. And I've looked at a range of literature, range of research in order to get these principles. So it covers not just clinical aspects, but a range of settings. So Mintzberg, who was a sort of academic and business orientated person, felt that in any organization, hierarchical organization, no one can claim to work without proper supervision. For proper functioning within an organization, there must be links between people, subsections of the organization, etc., in order to make positive outcomes. So this was from years ago, but it still holds today, and it's very important. And I can't stress the importance of supervision. And I know it might be not steeped in it like I am, being a clinical psychologist, but I can't stress the benefits of supervision generally. Next slide, please. So another businessman in a big organization in America looked at people do not generally do what you expect, of course, but what you inspect, i.e. that which is not inspected is not done as a principle. So inspection and overseeing and supervision arise really in a key response to a positive inherent goodness within an organization that functions properly. Next slide, please. So, as we all know, in the realms of health, certainly, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So if it's not inspected, it was not done. Next slide, please. So, looking at a range of research and literature under supervision and for principles across the board in psychological settings, nursing, education, public organization, business, I've picked out some common themes that apply to supervision across the board. Very important. Next slide, please. So, supervision is a process, and it provides a mechanism for governance within an organisation, which provides accountability for individuals and supervisors, management, layers of people within an organisation, any organisation. It looks and focuses upon organisational performance with a view to better outcomes, both as for individuals and for the organisation as a whole. And of course, as Kim was pointing out, the outcome, of course, is for better quality of service to whoever, not only to patients, service users, but anybody who receives services from any particular organisation. Next slide, please. So some of the key themes. It's a professional, cooperative, and reciprocal and flexible sort of relationship between a supervisor and a supervisee. It has social influence on an organisation, and that can mean anything from individuals to connections with other organisations. It proposes and tries to enhance people's knowledge, individual development of skills within any individual, within an organisation, and also connectivity between organisations and what you're each trying to achieve in a domain. It also looks at joint endeavours, and it relates to standards and effectiveness, and provides a governance framework around outputs and outcomes within any organisation. It's really key, and I often ask myself when I'm doing these things and when I'm working generally, if you didn't have the framework of supervision, what mechanisms would you be using in order to look at the governance and seeing that people are delivering on what they should be delivering, and have some audit and sort of governance frameworks about outputs, and so enhance professional sort of effectiveness and competency generally. Next slide, please. So further key themes, as I say, improves outcomes generally, look at authority and power differences within individuals and in organisations, very important for outcomes. Having objectives, clear objectives from the start of supervision, which relate to your outcomes of an organisation. Supervision can include a range of activities. It's not just a one-off activity. It's a developmental process across time. It's got a potential for using psychological theories in order to improve practice and organisational outcomes, and it can be reflective not only in practice but as a sort of entire organisational aim and objective to be reflective and flexible in outcomes. Next slide, please. So, key to all this is the nature of the supervisory relationship, which will be focused on later on in this presentation. So, as in therapy, it's more than a set of techniques. It's more than a book learned technique application. The interpersonal connectivity between supervisors and supervisees in their organisation, and importantly, what I've called a match between supervisors and supervisees, is absolutely critical. So you're trying to facilitate promotion of good practice in supervision, you're trying to achieve goals, and also it's important to look at what hinders progress within supervision. For example, a difference in attitude of supervisor and supervisees, a difference in outlook in terms of what people think are organisational goals. But it should be a safe place to look at these issues and be able to bring up the things that concern you in terms of equity, culture. The whole area of transparency needs to be in a safe place promoted by supervision. Can't stress it enough. Next slide, please. So, considering functions of supervision, which is a key delivery point of the supervisory process. So this is a health paradigm by Inskip and Proctor from approximately 1993, but there have been many iterations of this, but can be applied to supervision process in general. So we have functions of a normative function, which is a managerial aspect of supervision, which also encompasses continuing professional development and issues of mandatory training, etc. A formative function, which is educational in terms of development of people's skills, knowledge and professional development. And formative, an educational aspect, developing knowledge and skills, and restorative, which is a supportive aspect, which looks at things like burnout, supportive capacities within organisations and within the supervisory relationship. Morrison has added a fourth dimension of personal support. However, this can be subsumed, if you like, under a restorative function. So those three key functions are very, very important in a supervisory context. Next slide, please. So those functions attempt to look at and incorporate legal and professional responsibilities for the organisation and within the supervisory relationship, an equity, diversity, inclusion function, and incorporating issues of authority and importance of reflective practice. Next slide, please. So the function of supervision also, and one of the key principles, is to provide a safe enough environment to explore the complex issues. And does that mean I've got a minute left? Okay, so sorry about that. So you experience social injustice and the need to act within supervision, a need to feel safe to explore all things in a transparent way, opportunities to gain and maintain supervision competencies. Next slide, please. What's the function difference depends upon the nature of the supervision and in the context in which that occurs. Next slide, please. May also depend on the type of supervision and the outcomes of supervision, which are outlined in there below. Enable reflection, develop and enhance teamwork, improvement of supervisees' efforts. Next slide, please. With an overall achievement within supervision of the following: planning, awareness of different methodology, regularity, completing over time, a developmental perspective. But I can't stress enough the awareness of the match between supervisor and supervisee in order to achieve this. So these are the principles. We've only got a short time to do it, so I hope you'll look upon this and enjoyed listening to the principles and see them develop further in the next presentations. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Janice. And I can only say that I know that you had so much knowledge about this, so we will make sure the slides are available with your notes afterwards, Janice. But really, thank you. I'm sorry you had to whiz through the last few.
Yes, thank you.
And I'm going to hand over to Erica now. So, Erica, I'm going to leave you to introduce yourself if you don't mind. But you're a chartered clinical psychologist.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Erica Mapule McInnes. I'm a chartered clinical psychologist and I work in independent practice. So next slide, please. Oh, and that's right, before you go to the next slide, I'll just say what my bit is going to be about. Can you go back, please? Global approaches to supervision. So I very much enjoyed listening to what Dr. Smith talked about, but what I understood, it was very much a westernized approach to supervision. And I'll explain why it's probably a westernized approach, because psychology is very westernized. We think that psychology came from the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, the Europeans who invaded, and that's the approach that we've got. But if we're in a global world where we've got people from different cultures entering professions, being supervisees, being supervisors, we need a global approach to supervision. And I'm going to give an example of an African psychology approach, which is one of many. So next slide, please. So the critical questions to start off with is, how do we, it says deconstruct there, but it should say decolonize. How do we decolonize the curriculum? So some of you who work in universities or have been aware of the media have come across the approach of decolonizing the curriculum, to say that the curriculum is very westernized. And how do we decolonize and re-indigenize? So yes, statues have been pulled down of people in Bristol, etc. But it's about how do we then fill that void, that if we're saying that we shouldn't always just follow the pathways that that Western people have laid, what do we do instead? And if there are Western, Eastern, Asian, African, Native American, otherwise known as Indigenous American approaches to everything, this includes supervision. And in this section, I'll limit it to an African psychology approach, just in the interest of time. But I am aware that there are other approaches as well. And I'll use the term Black, African, and African with a K interchangeably. Next slide, please. So if the British Psychological Society and the Health Council, Professions Council want to attract more people of African ancestry into health professions or into the professions that are regulated, does supervision need to address their issues? So that's a critical question we need to ask. Next slide, please. And what are some of the experiences common to people of African ancestry that they may need to bring into supervision? Janice has talked about, Dr. Smith talked about the restorative function of supervision. What are those experiences that supervision needs to be open to express? Next slide, please. Okay, so what I've done here is the 7 Ds of oppression of people of African ancestry, and I've built on the work of Dr. Shelley Harrell here. But these Ds can also apply to other cultures as well. So it's not just people of African ancestry, but it's come out of Dr. Harrell's analysis of people of African ancestry. So the first D she puts is dehumanization, in terms of how treated, enslavement, the legacy of colonization. So people will be aware a few years ago of George Floyd and how he was murdered by the police, and it was recorded, and the Black Lives Matters movement. So there are multiple examples of dehumanization of Black people across the globe. Delusion, the delusion that people of African ancestry didn't achieve anything, to the extent that there needs to be Black History Month, and it was in October in the UK, it's in February in the USA, to put our achievements out there, because there's a common acknowledgement that our achievements are often not acknowledged. The next one, disempowerment. Sometimes people are structurally powerful in that they're given a position, but functionally not powerful. If you think that there's a system of white supremacy, it may mean that somebody doesn't have much power, because the next time they go out to the shop, they can be followed, accused and thought that they're a thief rather than a genuine customer. People have experience of shopping while Black or driving while Black. So that sort of disempowerment. And in supervision, the person may have had lots of experience of disempowerment before they get into the supervision room. Disconnection from land, family, origin, each other. Quite often people of African ancestry need to travel to the West to access the resources that have been taken from their country of origin. Destruction, a lot of their achievements are taken and put in museums when they are acknowledged. Distraction, communities of African ancestry often have one problem after another in terms of gaining access to health services, education services, legal justice, those types of things. And dispiriting, this can be dispiriting if people work as hard as they do, but they're still not given access to the fruits of their labour. Next slide, please. Apologies if I seem like I'm rushing, but I'm just aware of time. So what is African psychology? I've said this is an example of a global approach. It's an ongoing synthesis of the best of African culture, values, thoughts and practice in constant exchange with the real world. And it acknowledges that not all aspects of African culture, value and thoughts is good. Just like any culture, not all aspects are good, but how do we take out the best bits? So next slide, please. Okay, what I'll do is I'll go on to the next slide in the interest of time. So if you go to the next slide, yeah. So it uses African psychology as a framework to analyse issues. So that includes looking at your spirit, so what energises you, the influence of your ancestors, which can influence your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviours. So in European culture, in the aristocracy, they often have a room which has their ancestors' portraits on the wall that then when they're having their fine lunches, they can look at. But other cultures have ways of remembering their ancestors and that influencing how they do things. The impact or not of a global system of white supremacy, that's often known as racism. And that can be looking at what strategies are working by you or the system for it not to be there, or if it is there, or how you're navigating that. And are there barriers, access issues or opportunities that are related to a global system of white supremacy that may be affecting a black supervisor or a black supervisee, or the people in the system that you're working with who may be from those cultures. Next slide, please. African psychology is a strength-based approach rather than a deficit model. So it'll be what is getting in the way of your learning, what could help remove barriers, the assumption that the person is teachable, and that being an approach to supervision. So it wouldn't be about punishing people and giving rewards and punishments to make them do things in supervision, but about how do we see them as good people, having strengths, but how do we take away the barriers? Looking at the difference of family structure. So if you go back, so if the supervision is managerial, if somebody's of African ancestry, their family structure may differ from a what is traditionally a westernized family structure. So their social supports may be different. So they may have a lot of people back home in another country that they are supporting, or not have those people around them if problems occur for support. And imposter syndrome. A lot of things are done to make people of African ancestry feel that they don't belong in terms of some of the names that they're called, some of the stereotypes. So imposter syndrome, there have been studies that said that that can be more of an issue. So people may need more affirming. Next slide, please. Facilitating care-fronting people, and that's not a spelling mistake, care-fronting as opposed to confronting. And it may be that part of maintaining a healthy personhood and healthy well-being is care-fronting people and systems when they do things that are not helpful. And it may be that supervision needs to provide the support for people to, in a sensitive way, raise issues and realise that people may not always get it right first time. It can be a process. Giving people space to vent their feelings and not pathologized for being either anxious or being angry about injustice that they see or injustice that happens to them. So that may be a normal reaction to an abnormal situation to actually become angry about something, for example. Matching the energy between the supervisor and the supervisee. If that energy is not matched, one may feel vibrant and the other may feel drained. And perhaps having that as an agenda item. And it may be about matching the energy within the systems. I know that I've sometimes gone into situations with lots of enthusiasm, want to get the problem sorted and look at a situation that's a problem. And what may happen is the people in that system are feeling drained because they're run down by the problem. What's the template for flourishing while black that the workplace, the team, the client, the family has? What template does the supervisee and supervisor have? And the pros and cons of asking another member of a culture for advice. So, for example, I live in Manchester, but can I speak for all Mancunians if somebody asks me a question about an issue that occurs? But sometimes that's what we ask another black person if there's an issue involving a black person. Next slide, please. So this year, what if the supervisor is black of African ancestry? Next slide. And yeah, I think I've mentioned this before about can people of African ancestry be structurally powerful but functionally powerless? So just because somebody's a supervisor in African ancestry doesn't mean that they necessarily have more power over somebody who is a supervisee and maybe of another culture which has more power. Next slide, please. So I'm just aware of the time. So if I just summarise what I've said in my bit, and the slides will be available, and I'm happy if people get in touch with me to ask me to expand on things. I've mentioned some critical questions, issues living while black, the need to decolonise the curriculum, a very brief introduction to African psychology, which is one way of decolonising the supervision space, applied it to supervision, and a few conclusions. Apologies if I've gone over time slightly. Thank you.
You're fine. You're absolutely fine. Erica, thanks so much. That's a whirlwind tour about a world approach. So thank you ever so much. And thanks for your examples. They were very thought-provoking. People have put illuminating in the chat. So can I introduce you to our next speaker? You can see that we have some amazing speakers today. We're very, very lucky to have you all join us today. And we're joined by Moira Lafferty, who I will let you explain what you do, Moira, if that's okay. And Moira is particularly going to look at sport and exercise psychology, aren't you, Moira?
I'm indeed, thank you very much. And thank you for the welcome. I'm Moira Lafferty. I'm Head of Psychology at the University of Chester and Chief Supervisor for the qualification in sport and exercise psychology for the BPS, which I'm going to refer to as QSEP. So next slide, please. What can I say about sport and exercise psychology? Well, it's the relative new kid on the block, Myers described it as, in terms of being a newer division within the division BPS, and it may be considered different to other domains in terms of its culture and community. And I'm going to explain some of those because I think some of the differences that we encounter within sport and exercise psychology may resonate with some other fields that come under the HCPC. We have some unique aspects and challenges when we think about supervision and supervision within context. And when I think about supervision and think what is good supervision for the sport and exercise psychologist, I think that supervisor has to combine art, experience, and theoretical knowledge of supervision to actually encapsulate supervised experience. Next slide, please. So why will I say sport and exercise psychology is a domain of difference? So first and foremost, it's an independent training route. So unlike other training routes to registration, candidates are on an independent journey. They may be on placements, not usually organisational based. So their training can involve a lot of smaller placements rather than one training base. And interestingly, when we think about trainees and our candidates, the supervisor can often be remote from them. And importantly, in terms of supervision, the supervisor is not usually linked to the placement. So the trainee may have a manager and a supervisor who's external to the management of the organisation and working with and outside of that organisational context. So we see supervision as being different towards that management aspect. Next slide, please. Within supervision in QSEP, I think one of the key things is about managing aspirations, the management of expectations. Not everyone, as a paper once said, works with David Beckham. So managing the level of expectation of the trainee about who they will get to work with, who they will gain experience from, and the realization that it's deep and dirty in the field in more ways than one. And often when you're working in a sport and exercise psychology environment, you're dealing with uncertainty. You can be doing an amazing job and a change in management can mean the trainee is left without a placement. It's also about managing the process. So a supervisor looking at a candidate on the QSEP has to think about that candidate's work-life balance. They may also be engaged in employment while they're training, and there's a workload of the training to manage. So supervision is looking at lots of different aspects within that. Next slide, please. We also need to think about supervision and the supervisor being able to manage the different cultures and contexts within which our trainees work. So from our point of view, we're thinking about different sports, different ages, different levels, and who the client is, in effect. You know, we can have multiple people involved in that relationship. There may be a junior athlete, a parent, a coach, a manager. So there's lots of different things to manage and to help people manage through that supervisory experience. Next slide, please. And I think one of the key things that I think about when I think about challenges and opportunities in supervision is supervisory time. So for everyone out there who acts as a supervisor, regardless of domain, we know that supervision may be a secondary job role. So they may be based in the university and offering supervision in and outside of that. We also need to think about how much supervisory time is taken up over process and what I term qualification components versus the actual face-to-face of supervision. You know, we think of supervision as that two-way relationship, as Janice explained, but there's also the things that go on behind supervision, the note keeping, the note taking, the preparation. So we need to think of that face-to-face time versus preparation. So how much time does supervision take up, regardless of your domain? We also need to think in terms of qualification and training when they think about reviewing and working in the case studies. So process versus experience, I often call it, in terms of that supervisory journey. Next slide, please. Oh, can we go back one? And go forward one, sorry, I thought we jumped around there. Sorry, Kim. Okay. I also think there's a relevance needed when you're supervising. And it's something that we see a lot in our field, and I know it will resonate with others, that actually giving good supervision, do you need also to be practicing within the field? So I call it that remaining deep and dirty in the changing world, retaining and developing knowledge. And I also think it's really important to retain and develop knowledge of cognate disciplines that may not necessarily be psychological. So for us, what is our latest medicine and sports science telling us? How do we integrate that into that process? I also think it's really important for us to have a network of supervisor support, because I think that's the next stage, and that's where we need to start to look, because I believe all supervisors can learn from each other and then take it back to the local level. Next slide, please. And then I think something that's different that may resonate is that our supervision can take place at numerous different levels. So it might be that someone's offering supervision because they're in private practice. They might be offering supervision through a university course. They might be offering supervision through an organisation such as a national governing body. So our supervisors come in with diverse ranges of experiences, diverse ways of operating. And those differing types of supervisory sort of start points may mean that somebody has many supervisees, may offer one-on-one supervision, may have group supervision as well. So in terms of the supervisory experience, it can differ between person to person. And I think that's really important when we think about supervision and what works and what doesn't work and what works for the individual, having what Janice talked about, that good fit and everything fitting together. So managing those different experiences, managing expectations of what supervision is and can be. If we move to the next slide, please. So what do I see as challenges or opportunities, both specific to QSEP supervision, but more widely in the domain? And I think we don't talk a lot or enough about the philosophical aspects of supervision. We talk about supervisory models and how we adopt them, which one we adopt, why, how does that link to our philosophical practice? I think in terms of moving the field forward, and I don't mean this just specific to QSEP, I think it's always about enhancing knowledge, understanding, differentiating between possibly personal philosophy, practice, model, and looking at what happens above and beyond and outside. You know, we've been heavily influenced in psychology by clinical psychology, but actually broadening our base of knowledge and understanding. And critically, the final point, I think, is one that we sometimes tend to fail to do, the sharing of experiences. Talking about supervision when supervision not went wrong, but maybe fractured, or maybe there was ruptures, but just looking at supervision in a different way, sharing the negatives as well as the positives, because we learn as much from what didn't go well as we learn from what does go well, and creating that safe space, psychological safety to share those experiences. . Next slide, please. So I think we've got some challenges, we've got some opportunities. For me, as my interest in supervision, it's about developing, enhancing specific competencies beyond the RAPS register, beyond a register that says, yeah, you're good to go. I also think we need to look at how we help neophyte practitioners. We've got them through the qualification, but they still need supervision. How do we ensure they're fit for practice? How do we ensure they're continuing to develop? What's the role of mentoring? And I think these are all critical questions that we need to think, regardless of your domain of work, but if you're in a supervisory capacity, how do we take supervision to the next level? Next slide, please. I think critically, when we look at supervision, and it links back to what Erica said, this notion of inclusiveness and inclusion in terms of supervision, having supervision accessible to everyone. And I think that's something that we're seeing in the chat, that notion of how do we make it accessible? How do we access? And I think they're both really critical questions. So in summary, supervising sport and exercise trainees is both similar and different to other domains, but they share a lot of commonalities, and it's those commonalities that we need to talk about and continue to talk about. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Moira. That was perfect. Thank you very much. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I love your challenges for supervision. Thanks ever so much for that. So we're now going to move on to, as I said, we've got a whirlwind exciting programme today. We're now going to hand back to Becca, who's going to talk about safeguarding and some of the ethical dilemmas when things go wrong, because I think this is really important when things go wrong. So I'm going to hand over to you, Becca, if that's okay.
Thank you. I know I'm really aware that we sort of can't see everybody's faces of the people who are joining us, and I know this is really pacey, but I hope that it's all of use, and it feels like we're all going to need to sort of digest all of this information and lie down and have a cup of tea. I think there's just been so much good stuff to think about. So I now have the challenge of having a few minutes to talk to you about safeguarding, ethical dilemmas and boundaries. So 3 very small issues. So of course we can't do them justice, but just to give a few things, next slide please, Kim, to for us really just to think about and to be curious about, and there'll be lots of further reading suggestions which Kim will send out. So in terms of thinking about ethical dilemmas, it's really helpful to think about the foundation that our work is based on, and to think about the ethical principles that we operate by. So I'm really conscious that not everyone on the call is a psychologist. In fact, I think OTs were most represented out of everybody, and we'll all have our different sort of focuses, but we'll certainly have a lot in common around ethical principles. So for psychologists coming under the BPS, these 4 primary ethical principles of respect, of core competence and responsibility and integrity then become the platform we stand on alongside our HCPC codes of conduct and practice codes that really help us in all decision making, not just ethical dilemmas. And there's a number of different models out there that sort of help us make difficult decisions. But when thinking about ethics, it's helpful to reground ourselves in those principles that we practice from. Next slide, please. I really wanted to go back to the primacy of the supervisory relationship, and I think it was Janice who was talking earlier about the match, and that's so key. We talk about that a lot, don't we, in our relationship in therapy, in other kinds of settings. The dynamic, the relational dynamic is so important, and that's really critical, comes up again and again in research on what's the secret sauce that makes supervision effective. There's many things, but primarily it is about the relationship, and that is really based in the level of trust between supervisor and supervisee, but also the credibility of the supervisor to the supervisee. And clinical supervision, as we've been hearing about, is really one of the primary forms of professional accountability that we have. So it's a really important part of our governance structures and really relies on that trust and honesty in the relationship. And when we have that trusting space, it means that we can have the freedom to grapple with difficult issues and ethical dilemmas. So that really feels critical. Next slide, please. When we're thinking about ethics, is really some questions to think about is the personal and professional values that we bring as individuals, and to have conversations in supervision about them, you know, at that contracting stage, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, grappling with, well, where's our starting points? What are we bringing? What are the power dynamics? And then really tuning into how is it that we know as professionals when something is off, because often with ethical dilemmas, it's the grey. It isn't actually a clearly cut and dry situation. Often it's the grey areas, the nuances, and we need to really be able to grapple with something that feels difficult. A helpful question to ask ourselves is, how often are we having uncomfortable conversations in supervision? And if we're not, why not? Does it feel safe to? Are we as supervisees really bringing what we need to bring in supervision? Are we as supervisors challenging our supervisees sufficiently and setting up? Often do we talk about process of supervision as well as content? It's really, really important to have that sense of fit and match. So really just want to echo what Janice said earlier, because all of these conversations and all of these issues are grappled with from that sense of fit and safety. Next slide, please. And of course, we all make mistakes. It happens. And of course, we don't want to, and we work incredibly hard to prevent mistakes happening, but they do occur. And the key thing is really how we respond when a mistake is made, or perhaps an error of judgment, or something that needs some more thought. It's important that supervision is a space in which those issues are grappled with, but where there's that honesty to really be fully accountable. You know, I work for the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. We've just published our final report and we're just sort of coming into land now. And what we've heard again and again from survivors of complete institutional failure is that the damage caused not just by the abuse, and where there was cover up and where there was deflection and denial and people not taking responsibility, that was deeply damaging to individuals. So this is really to acknowledge that we don't get it right all of the time, and it's really how we respond to recognizing that is key, and supervision is such an important part of that process. Next slide, please. So thinking now a bit about boundaries on our whistle-stop tour, there's lots of models that are really useful out there. This is just one of many by someone called Stephen Power, and it just gives you a few different areas where you can think about the boundaries in that area. And this is really helpful exercise to go through when you're contracting for supervision, or if you're having a review of supervision. So thinking about the boundaries of the relationship itself and the dynamic between supervisor and supervisee. Thinking about if there's any conflicts of interest. Is it a line management relationship? Are there any mechanisms of feedback? What does that look like? And really negotiating that and having full transparency between you. The boundaries of the content that is and isn't brought. Where are the edges of that, and feeling some of that out and agreeing that. And the boundaries of time and space, which of course has changed hugely for all of us in how we work. And finally, confidentiality. Often we engage with confidentiality, I feel, with this sort of rote, I'm just going to rehearse those limits of confidentiality of it's confidential unless X, Y, and Z. And the risk there is that we become really desensitized to the actual limits of confidentiality. Often there are some grey areas, and so that's really helpful to grapple with at the beginning of supervision, or if you're well sort of into supervision relationships, to just bring it up and have a conversation, so that some of that is prepared for when there is then a time when you need to perhaps grapple with some of those boundaries with a live situation, a live case. Next slide, please. So just, yeah, again, a couple of questions to think about there. just to pick out one point from all of that I would say that's really helpful is being clear on expectations, and that's where contracting and reviews are really helpful. I quite like to schedule reviews, so rather than just relying on just remembering to do it, actually when you know it's in the diary, and we just sort of check in and recalibrate, because supervision is such a developmental process that needs change over time, and so we really need to go back to those objectives that were spoken about before, going back on expectations and what the supervisee needs. So being able to communicate that as a supervisee and leading that as a supervisor is really important. Next slide, please. And then, of course, a word on when things go wrong. And there's going to be inclusion of this in the guidance, most likely, that comes out next year. But just to acknowledge that rupture and repair cycle happens arguably in any relational context. We have these bumps in the road, and they might be doing all sorts of things. It might be personal between us. It might be mirroring. It might be a parallel process of what's happening with the person that is being talked about, the client that's being focused on, or the organizational dynamic, and that might be played out between us. But there are times where actually it's more serious than a rupture, and actually it's abuse of power or something that is more harmful and damaging. And it's really important to acknowledge that that does happen. It's something that isn't really talked about a huge amount, but when it does occur and there's harm to a supervisee, absolutely that needs to be taken so seriously, and action needs to be taken. And I think as supervisors, we need to be open to the concept that any supervisor could cause harm, and so to stay reflective, keeping up to date in all of our learning and development, and having our own supervision, of course, as well. And just to say on that there is, of course, the HCPC duty of candour to be really honest and transparent. So that's really important to bear in mind as well. And then in my final minute, a whistle-stop tour of safeguarding. So there's going to be a whole list of legislation in your follow-up pack that it's worth having a look at. But I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Firstly, it's really important, and forgive me if this is all very obvious, but to be really aware of where thresholds differ, safeguarding thresholds for action and for potentially sharing something without consent and so on, differ across different services. They aren't all the same, and sometimes those differences can be quite considerable. The appetite for risk can vary hugely in terms of risk management processes, so it's really important to be clear on that in supervision, because it might be, if a risk issue is being discussed in supervision, the supervisor and supervisee really need to understand what those service policies are and what the legislation is and what the boundaries are and what actions would need to be taken next. A challenge to you as well is to say, do you feel fully up to date on your safeguarding training? And if you don't, then get hold of some. And excellent record keeping. You know, I often sort of ask myself, if the notes I just wrote were put before the judge, would I be happy with that? Would I be happy with the quality of what I've written? We really need to ensure that our record keeping is to an excellent standard. And then the final thing just to say is it's really important to be aware of legislation that impacts safeguarding and to be plugged into your professional network, which obviously you all are, or you wouldn't be on this seminar. But it is really important because things change. And I think I didn't really appreciate that as a practitioner until I was qualified a few years, and I really realised how important it is to stay plugged in, of course, with HCPC as our regulator, but also with our professional bodies, to stay really linked with peers and be aware where updates have taken place. So, for example, you may or may not be aware that there is a new recommendation as part of the inquiry's work on mandatory reporting, where some professions will be legally compelled to report if there's any allegation of child sexual abuse made. So changes like that in the law, we need to really be aware of it. Next slide, please. So these last couple of slides are just some principles of safeguarding, just to refresh our memories. But I would really encourage you to take some time to have a look at that legislation, a long list of which Kim will share. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Becca. That's fantastic. And I know that you've, again, like all these speakers have submitted a fantastic list of references. So I can only promise that we will put them up as soon as the session's finished. And I'm going to hand over to Anita and Julianne now, if that's all right. And they're going to really look at, I think I was the one with the this is the right spelling, isn't it, Julie? It was me that I had that awful feeling, you know, when you see something, you think it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong, but it isn't. So do explain what you're going to cover, if that's all right.
Absolutely. So Anita and I are going to be a collaborative effort this afternoon looking at equity, diversity and inclusion. I'll let Anita introduce herself.
Hi, my name's Anita. I'm an educational psychologist. I work at the University of Birmingham as well as in independent practice here in the West Midlands.
And I'm Julianne Aspin. I'm a BPS chartered and HCPC registered forensic psychologist. I work within London as a cluster lead psychologist, and I've worked within HCPC psychology service for over 28 years. So next slide, please. So for effective supervision to take place, where diversity, inclusion and equity is at the very core, a supportive and positive environment is needed. And this is reflected within the HCPC standards of effective supervision. So as supervisors, creating a really honest, open and supportive environment where a supervisee feels confident to reflect on their practice and discuss any concerns is crucial. So creating a supportive environment really helps to develop a trusting and open relationship between supervisor and supervisee. And in turn, that really helps to identify the training and support needs more effectively for that supervisee. So psychological safety is an extremely crucial factor, and I think it's threaded through quite a number of the previous presentations and speakers this afternoon. But having psychological safety enables those truly open and genuine discussions between supervisor and supervisee. And the diagram on the first slide is actually reflective of the impact of not having psychological safety. Next slide, please, Kim. So as a supervisor, it's our duty and our role to foster a supervisory environment that creates psychological safety, where there's a positive professional relationship that's based on mutual trust and respect between the supervisor and supervisee. And in such an environment, this is where we're going to be able to really acknowledge, welcome and accept the diversity of different approaches, styles, the perspectives, the experiences of our supervisees in order to allow all of our supervisees to reach their potential. And Clark 2020 writes in great detail about the 4 stages of psychological safety. And when I was reviewing some of that literature, I was thinking about what would that look like within a supervisory setting. So thinking about inclusion safety. So this would be where a supervisee feels safe, they're comfortable being present, they don't feel excluded, and they feel like they're wanted and they're appreciated. So thinking about learner safety, this would be where the supervisee is able to learn through asking questions, making and admitting mistakes, but also asking for help. In terms of contributor safety, the supervisee would feel safe to contribute their own ideas without fear of embarrassment or ridicule. And then finally, looking at challenger safety, where a supervisee can question a supervisor's ideas and also suggest changes to ideas or plans or different ways of working. And something that really struck me was really around psychological safety not being a sort of on-off phenomenon. It's actually a sliding scale, and it's a sliding scale that will change throughout the supervisory journey. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this particular diagram reflects and interprets the interrelationship between psychological safety, inclusion, diversity and performance. So psychological safety is a precursor not only to performance, but to inclusion and diversity. How can we be diverse if we're not inclusive? And how can we be inclusive if we don't foster psychological safety? So inclusion is crucial, and supervisors must make a constant effort to deeply empathise with the life experiences and perspectives of our supervisees. And this might mean challenging our own beliefs and our own perceptions. And it's via this behaviour that true inclusion can manifest. True inclusion where everyone is welcome, everyone feels safe, free to be their true selves, and we all get to enjoy psychological safety. Psychological safety is crucial in enabling truly open and genuine discussions between supervisor and supervisee. Perceived safety in the supervisor-supervisee relationship can actually influence the level of supervisee self-disclosure. So in terms of supervisees actually feeling that they can admit and talk through mistakes, but it also has a massive impact on supervisee outcomes. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Julie. So thinking about what we've talked about so far, Julie's talked about psychological safety, and I suppose my slides now are beginning to think, well, how can we make that happen? So in order for psychological safety to be in place, there needs to be openness from both sides, the supervisee and the supervisor. And there's been much discussion by everyone from Erica, Janice, Moira, Julie, Rebecca about the importance of that supervisory alliance and that supervisory relationship. People need to be in sync with each other. We can only get that in sync relationship if both the supervisee and the supervisor are open with each other and begin to talk about the issues of similarity and difference that may occur between each other. That's not always easy. It can feel very difficult to say those things, particularly as you're probably doing it quite early on in the relationship. However, it needs to be attended to throughout, because then that's how issues of equity, diversity and inclusion and power, most importantly, will be considered. Now, there's a temptation to think, well, who's responsible for that kind of power balance? And research would tell us that supervisees recognise that it's really important, whereas supervisors can tend to overlook it and assume that there's equitable power between the two. However, both parties share the responsibility. Ellis has found that in their work around harmful supervision, that you've got to look at the different aspects of both people's identity and culture and how that's going to impact practice, supervision and the supervisory relationship. Amarati and Kaslow, as mentioned there, state that you've got to give it really honest attention. And that, as I say, at the beginning of a supervisory relationship is not easy. I've noticed that there's much discussion in the chat about mismatch and match. Well, we can only match if we talk to each other about our similarities and differences. And hopefully we're going to talk about a way that that can be managed. This is particularly important when you're working cross-culturally and across majority and minority groups. So that would refer to, I suppose, sometimes what may be more visible differences as well as considering more invisible differences. So next slide, please. So, as I've said, we need to consider the power differential and how we can make sure that that power differential is in place. And in a moment, on the next slide, I'm going to show you a diagram that illustrates the different powers that we have to attend to in a supervisory relationship. Can we go on to the next slide, actually, please? That'd be easier. Thank you. So this diagram that comes from Hawkins and McMahon is a really, really helpful way, I think, of conceptualising the power that might lie in the room between the supervisor and the supervisee. There's the role power, which is the power that's inherent in the roles that are held in the room. And in the slide there, it mentions the role of supervisor. However, there may be other roles that are evident in the room. Moira touched upon the roles of maybe if have got some accountability or you're the academic supervisor as well. This may mean that there's other role power that needs to be acknowledged. Cultural power is the cultural power that's held by the dominant social and ethnic group. And I think it's worth just acknowledging people's cultural power and where they come from and how they've come to where they are. And then personal power is that separate power that can come in the force of kind of personality and who is able to speak assertively and more powerfully. So we have to attend to all three aspects of power and be clear about what they are from, I would argue, quite early on in the relationship. Can we go on to the next slide, please?
Thank you, Nita. So this diagram is a visual representation reflecting the multiple factors of advantage and disadvantage, which you may have seen referred to in the literature as intersectionality. So this approach to diversity really acknowledges how somebody's race, gender, their class, their age, or other characteristics all interconnect. And they interconnect to form a personal experience of life and work, which brings both advantages and disadvantages and privileges. So intersectionality is critical for true inclusion. So thinking about intersectionality within a supervisory environment, where we use a lens of intersectionality, this enables supervisees to feel seen and heard, regardless of what their intersections are. They belong and they feel psychologically safe. Additionally, this approach recognises that each person has different circumstances and highlights the need for equity in enabling an individual to reach their potential. So intersectionality considers a collection of factors that affect a social individual in combination, so rather than just considering each factor in isolation. And Runyon in 2018 talked about where supervisory practice takes intersectionality as a priority. Supervisees feel seen, heard, belong, and feel psychologically safe. And Gazanka in 2020 described intersectionality as a critical framework for conceptualising human experience, particularly power and inequality. Next slide, please.
So one way that we've been, I suppose, trialling, enacting culturally sensitive and culturally responsive supervision is by using the social graces model that some of you might be familiar from Burnham. So he uses the acronym of graces to consider different aspects of identity that could be drawn upon. This is by no means meant to be the total list. There could be others that are added. However, it does offer us a list to think about. And so in the contracting aspect of supervision, in the early stages of supervision, after you've discussed maybe the more administrative sides of how you're going to work together and what you're going to do, there's an opportunity to share your identity, both the voiced and the visible parts of your identity. So for me, that would be being Indian, being a woman, as well as the unvoiced and less visible aspects of my identity. So both parties, supervisor and supervisee, would share maybe 2 or 3 of the graces that they consider really relevant to their journey to where they are today. The other party would listen and say back what they've heard to show that they're listening actively. And that often leads to a dialogue between both parties about how we're maybe different to each other, but also how both parties may be similar to each other. It's also important maybe to look at the bits that are invisible to us, the taken for granted aspects of one's identity that one's never had to consider, because these can be the places where potential oppression can come. So it's useful to consider one that you've taken for granted all your life. And again, maybe discuss that, both of you taking that in turns, because again, in turn, you can then think about, well, how can we make sure our supervision covers all that it needs to be covered and we don't end up kind of colluding with each other to ignore certain key aspects. I think when there's unvoiced aspects, when the person is in the majority group, it can be more difficult sometimes to notice what is part of your culture. Sometimes it can be easier to notice the bits of you that are different. So by doing this activity that I'm very briefly describing, but happy to send more information on, and this allows a discussion of similarity and difference, which will in turn, and I suppose almost unconsciously, but consciously too, lead to a discussion of the cultural power of both parties in the supervision and their values, which therefore supports, as Julie was talking about, a really positive climate for psychological safety, which we'd agree, hopefully, is the optimum conditions for good supervision. And that brings us to the end of our little bit, Kim.
That's just perfect. Thank you so much. And actually, your model at the end, I think, rounds up a lot of the conversation that's been going on in chat. I think most of the questions have been answered in chat. It's really been more of a supportive, encouraging chat where people have been talking about issues that they've been experiencing and then answering each other's questions. But I suppose to sum up all the presentations, there's a definite theme that's emerging, isn't there, about power relationships, mismatch, cultural differences, equality, equity, diversity, and how that actually affects the supervisory relationship. And I think it's been great to finish with you, Julie and Anita, because you've given that last, I think, going back to that GRACE model, to actually, I love that, to actually have that conversation with your supervisor. I think it's a really good note to end on, because I actually think it's a really good take-home message that I'm certainly going to take with I do group supervision. I'm going to just throw that into the group, and I think I'm going to focus on the ones that are not hidden, but the ones we perhaps don't see, our unconscious graces that we need to focus on. So thank you very much for that, Julie and Anita. That really rounds it up really well. I'm going to finish on a few resources that are really useful for us about supervision, but also things that are going on at the Health and Care Professionals Council that you might need to know about. We always have our events pages, and I know that Patrick will put the link to our events pages up in chat. We've nearly finished the series of our webinars now, but if you'd like to join any future ones, then keep an eye on our events pages. And just to say that we have a quarterly employer newsletter, and we're also got some really good, we're in the middle of a preceptorship consultation at the moment. So if you want to come along and voice your opinions about our preceptorship guidelines, that would be really useful at the moment. We are at the moment also in consultation for changes to our fees, and again, do come along to our open webinars to talk about that, but also do take time to complete the consultation on that. It's really important. There is a survey that I'm just about to put in chat, and I'm going to leave that in chat while we just see if there's any last minute questions, but there is a survey that we're going to put in chat to see whether you'd like to just write in, if you don't mind, what you felt about the session today. It's been a real good overview of some of the thoughts around supervision. So we started off looking at the Health and Care Professionals Council information on supervision, and as Nigel said, the BPS guidelines on supervision are being currently in final draft at the moment. Janice has kindly, thank you very much, Janice, talked about the principles of supervision and some of the key aspects of supervision, and enabled me certainly to think a lot more deeply about supervision. And then Erica's given a very thoughtful, inspiring talk about world approaches to supervision. I found that very insightful. And Moira kindly talked about sports and exercise case studies and how that actually works in practice. And Becca's maybe think about some of the ethical, safe issues related to supervision and safeguarding, which I probably hadn't thought greatly about before, but how that links to safeguarding. With Julie and Anita kindly bringing it all together, I think, looking at more about the whole issue about this mismatch and what to do in that situation, and putting forward a really fantastic model, which is really useful. So I'm going to leave that survey open, and I'm perhaps going to ask Becca if she's got time just to come on for the last couple of minutes just to have some final thoughts, and then perhaps Nigel to close the seminar if that's okay. Becca, would you mind popping on just to say a few things, then we'll pass over to Nigel to close the seminar.
Sure. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm aware that, oh, good. I know in the chat it looked like I sort of was dipping in and out. Apologies for that. I think just a reflection from me is just how rich the conversation has been today, and it feels like certainly I'm taking away a huge amount, and I feel like there were more hours in the day to go and do some reading. But I think what has really just impacted me today is thinking about just how important that supervisory space is, and how important it is to protect it, because I'm aware we're in a context where we're all working just incredibly hard with a number of different challenges, and often it's supervision and it's other sort of forms of that kind of reflective practice that can get pushed out of the diary, isn't it? And I'm just really sitting with that sense of we need it more than ever, really. But a huge thanks to all the presenters today. I've got tons to think about, and it's just been a great space, so thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Becca. And Nigel, thanks for your help and contribution pulling this together. You've been real linchpin in pulling this all together today. So if you don't mind, after my thanks to everybody, and particularly thanks to the speakers, but can I also a big thank you to Fiona, Patrick and Becky in the background. But Nigel, I'm going to leave you to finish off the webinar, if that's okay.
Thank you very much indeed. I've been watching the chat and been trying to answer people's questions. Those questions have been very wide and ranging and varied, but what I've been really impressed with is the feedback on the contributors sessions. It's been a fantastic response in the chat, so for all of those people that have taken the time to do that, thank you very much indeed. I think attendees have found the range and variety of the speakers and what they had to say really very helpful indeed. So and I just want to say thank you all for attending and giving up some of your time today. One last request from me, if I may, is please do put some further suggestions in the survey. Kim and I will be considering those, and I'm sure that although this is the first webinar between the BPS and the HCPC, it certainly won't be the last. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, for your attention, for attending, and for your helpful contributions. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. Have a lovely
Bye.
rest of your afternoon.
Bye.